They told me not to ruin the photographs. That is how the day began for me. Not with kindness or joy, but with a sentence that sliced through my chest like a blade wrapped in silk. Mom, please, stay out of the wedding photos. This is my day, not yours. I can still hear her voice, my daughter's voice, calm but sharp, her eyes refusing to meet mine, as if even my gaze might stain the clean, polished image she had so carefully constructed for the world. In that moment, I realized I was not a mother anymore, not in her eyes. I was a risk, a shadow, an imperfection that needed to be managed. Imagine reaching 74 years old, having spent decades cooking meals that nobody remembered to thank you for, scrubbing clothes that were worn until the threads broke, wiping tears from a face that once looked up at you as if you were the sun itself, and then to be told, on what should have been a day of celebration, that your presence was not only unnecessary, but undesirable. That is what I carried with me into that bright morning, like a stone in the pocket of my heart. I should tell you who I am, or rather, who I have become. I am 74, and I live alone now in a small apartment that smells of lavender and floor polish. The walls are thin, the neighbors loud, but the space belongs to me, and no one can tell me to move to the side. I make tea in the evenings. I keep my curtains open, and I sleep in a bed that feels too wide, but at least is my own. Still, memory is a stubborn tenant, and it brings back rooms I once filled with warmth, photographs I once hung with pride, conversations I once believed meant love. On the morning of my daughter's wedding, I put on the dress I had chosen with care, a deep navy with small pearl buttons that reminded me of my own mother's Sunday best. I pressed it 3 times the week before, terrified of wrinkles, and I added a silver necklace, the same one my husband had given me on our 30th anniversary, the one I had always imagined my daughter might borrow someday. When I looked in the mirror, I saw lines, yes, but also dignity. I saw a woman who had lived, who had given, who had survived. But when my daughter saw me, she looked away as if she were embarrassed, and then she told me to step aside, to keep out of sight, to remain invisible. Do you know what it means to be erased in plain view? It is not like death, because death at least carries ritual, mourning, the acknowledgement that you existed. Erasure is quieter, crueler. It is being alive and breathing while someone insists you are not fit to be seen. That morning, standing near the bridal suite, I held my hands together to stop them from trembling, though nobody was watching closely enough to notice. I smiled when the photographer passed, though he barely glanced at me, already moving toward the young women in silk dresses and the men with pressed suits. I became part of the furniture, the necessary background, the woman who ironed her dress but was not meant to appear in the gallery. And yet, inside me, another voice stirred. The voice that remembered carrying that same daughter in my arms through fevers. The voice that remembered paying for her piano lessons when we had no money for meat. The voice that remembered holding her hair back the night of her first heartbreak when she vomited into the sink from crying too hard. That voice whispered that I had been here all along, that my story could not be untold just because someone wished for a perfect photograph. So yes, I live alone now, and I suppose that means I have learned to carry silence as if it were company. But the silence that day was heavier because it was not mine by choice. It was given to me as an order, as if my presence was contamination, as if love itself could be polished out of the frame. She said it so casually, my daughter, like she was asking me to pass the salt. Mom, Stay out of the wedding photos. And perhaps that is what hurt the most, that she did not even flinch when she said it, did not consider the way her words would burn into me like acid through fabric. It was rehearsed, prepared, part of the script she had written in her head for how the day should look. I was not in that script. I was backstage, meant to wait until the curtain closed, until the applause faded, until the lights went out. But I am still here, and I remember. Even now, years later, when I walk past photo studios with framed portraits of families in their windows, I feel something twist inside. Smiling faces, arms linked, generations pressed together as if nothing could separate them. But I know better. I know that sometimes a mother is asked to stand aside, to crop herself out, to erase her history so that her child can present a flawless future. And what haunts me is not only that I agreed in that moment, not only that I nodded and smiled and pretended it was fine, but that a part of me believed it was the natural order of things, that I was meant to fade while she shone. That is the cruelty of age. Not just that your body weakens, but that you start to accept the ways the world tells you that you are less. I see it now. I see it too clearly. So that is who I am. I am the woman asked to step out of the photograph. The mother turned into a shadow at the edge of the celebration, the guest at her own child's triumph. And yet, and this I did not know then, the truth has a way of slipping into the frame no matter how hard people try to keep it out. Because though she asked me to stay invisible, though she wanted her perfect album without my aging face, without the weight of what I had lived through, the world still saw me. The stage, the microphone, the unshakable fact of my existence, they saw me. And that, perhaps, is where my story really begins. The catalyst was not a thunderclap, not an accident of timing or misunderstanding, but a deliberate act of exclusion, a choice that revealed itself slowly, like a stain spreading across cloth, until I could no longer pretend it was anything else. The rehearsal dinner had already given me hints of what was to come. The way my daughter introduced me not as her mother, but simply as Mary to a few of her friends, as if I were a distant relative or a polite acquaintance rather than the woman who had given her life, raised her through storms and sacrifices, and carried the memory of her first steps like a jewel locked deep in my chest. At first, I told myself it was nerves, that brides have so much on their minds, that perhaps she simply slipped into a formality without thinking. But when the photographer arrived that evening, with his heavy equipment and practiced smile, she guided him toward every cluster of people except the one I was standing in, and when I hovered for a moment nearby, she touched my wrist lightly and whispered, "Not this one, Mom, maybe later." The words were soft, but the dismissal was iron. I laughed nervously, made a small joke about not being photogenic, and stepped aside. But inside, I felt a crack forming, a hairline fracture that would split wide open the next day. The morning of the wedding was filled with hurried steps, chatter, the smell of hairspray and perfume, and I stood quietly in the corner of the bridal suite, clutching my small handbag like a talisman, hoping for a moment to share with her, some little intimacy between mother and daughter before she walked down the aisle. Instead, I became a spectator in a room I had once imagined being central to. I had pictured helping her fasten the buttons on her dress, smoothing her veil, whispering to her that she was beautiful and strong and ready. Instead, those duties fell to her friends, her bridesmaids, all younger, all brighter in her eyes, all part of the curated vision she had chosen for her day. When she turned to me at last, it was not with gratitude or affection, but with instruction. "Mom, please stay in the back during the photos. The photographer knows the plan." The plan. That word struck me harder than I expected. A plan had been made, one that did not include me except perhaps as a silent body in a pew, a name on a program, a woman whose presence could be acknowledged but not displayed. After the ceremony, while the guests laughed and spilled champagne across white tablecloths, the photographer began arranging the family shots on the church steps. My heart quickened as I saw the pattern unfold. Bride and groom, groom's parents, groom's siblings, bride with her friends, bride with distant relatives I barely knew. I hovered again, clutching my small clutch bag tighter, waiting for my name, for the inevitable call. "Mother of the bride, please step in." It never came. I was standing only a few feet away when my daughter glanced at me, her face tightening in that subtle way she has when she wants to manage a situation without making a scene. She walked over, heels clicking on the stone, and leaned close enough that only I could hear. "Mom, not now. Please, just let us handle this. We don't want too many people in these shots. It gets messy. Later, we'll do some with you. I promise." But there was no later. The session went on. Frame after frame, her radiant smile shining for everyone else, her hands linked with everyone else's, while I stood there, half in shadow, trying not to let the tears sting my eyes, because I knew mascara would betray me. The real blow came when one of the relatives, a distant cousin of my late husband, stepped over and whispered sympathetically, "Don't worry. Sometimes they do a special album, just for the close family." I did not know how to answer, because wasn't I the closest family she had? Hadn't I been the one to stay awake by her bed when she coughed so hard as a child she thought she would choke? Hadn't I been the one to work double shifts so she could go to university without debt weighing down her shoulders? But in that moment, I was not close. I was an inconvenience, something that might spoil the perfect geometry of the photograph, a reminder that time had passed, that beauty does not last untouched, that mothers eventually become older women with lined faces and bodies that do not fit the sleek mold of the bridal vision. As the sun lowered and the banquet began, I sat at my assigned table near the back, not with the immediate family, but with distant acquaintances, people who barely knew me, and I realized that this was not chance or oversight. It was design. I had been placed where I would not appear too prominently in photographs, where my laughter, my voice, my very being would not intrude upon the tableau my daughter wanted to present. That is when the truth crystallized, sharp and undeniable. I was not meant to be part of her wedding as a mother. I was meant to be part of it as a prop, a silent extra who knew better than to step into the light. The catalyst, then, was not simply her words, though they cut deep. It was the arrangement of everything around those words: the seating, the photographs, the polite but firm instructions, the careful choreography of absence. It was the realization that my child, whom I had once thought would carry me with her into every new chapter of her life, had chosen to edit me out of the picture, literally and figuratively. And yet, beneath the humiliation, a different flame began to burn, faint but persistent. Because as I watched her pose and laugh and sparkle for the camera without me, I understood something vital. Erasure can only succeed if you accept it. They could crop me out of the photos, but they could not crop me out of the truth. And somewhere, beneath the ache, a quiet defiance began to form, one that would not let me stay silent forever. The quiet worsening of it all did not strike like lightning. It settled slowly, like fog seeping under a door, until the entire room of that day was heavy with it, and I could not breathe without tasting the metallic bitterness of being set aside. After the ceremony, when everyone moved toward the reception hall, I found myself walking behind, not beside, as though the invisible script had cast me in a secondary role. My daughter moved like a queen. Her friends fluttered around her like attendants. The photographer trailed them as if she were royalty whose every step deserved to be documented, and I was left carrying my own coat, careful not to let it drag on the floor, careful not to bump into anyone who might wonder what place I had there at all. I should have been radiant with pride, but instead I felt reduced, diminished, like a misplaced relative who had stumbled into someone else's celebration. They placed me at a table in the far corner of the banquet hall, a table that was not empty, but filled with people I barely knew, distant acquaintances of the groom's family, men who spoke of stocks and women who spoke of vacations, none of them asking who I was, until finally one woman leaned across the table and asked politely, "So, how do you know the bride?" And I forced a smile and said, "I raised her." She laughed lightly, thinking I was joking, and turned back to her wine glass. The lights glittered on the chandeliers above, the music swelled, and every toast was an exercise in performance. The groom's family spoke eloquently. The friends cracked rehearsed jokes. Everyone praised the couple as if they were saints stepping into history. And all the while, I sat with my hands folded tightly in my lap, waiting for my turn, waiting for the moment someone would look toward me, gesture, invite me to the microphone so I could at least say one sentence of truth. But the moment did not come. When the master of ceremonies announced that the next segment would be the cutting of the cake, my heart sank into my stomach. The night was moving forward without me, as if I were not there, as if the decades of my life spent building this woman into who she was had been erased like chalk from a board. I ate slowly, tasting little, swallowing often to cover the ache rising in my throat. Around me, the guests laughed, glasses clinked, and the photographer hovered like a moth around a flame, capturing every smile except mine. When he passed near me, I sat up straighter, smoothed my dress, tried to look composed, hoping he might notice, might decide that a mother at least deserved one candid shot. But he turned his lens toward the dance floor, where the bridesmaids twirled in coordinated delight. That was when I realized this exclusion was not accidental. It was the design of the evening itself, a choreography in which my role was silence and invisibility. My daughter had not simply forgotten me. She had planned around me, ensured that I would not be in the center, that my presence would not complicate the perfect imagery she wanted the world to see. It was not one act of cruelty, not one word of rejection. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small gestures that settled like dust on my skin. A waiter passed by and offered wine to every guest at the table except me until I raised my hand and asked quietly. A cousin I had not seen in years greeted me with hesitation, saying, "Oh, I didn't realize you were here. I didn't see you in the photos." The groom's aunt asked if I was comfortable all the way in the back, as though I had chosen to exile myself from the heart of the room. And then, when I finally gathered the courage to rise and move closer to the head table, to perhaps stand near my daughter for a moment, to let the photographer catch me in the background of her glow, one of the planners intercepted me with a polite but firm smile. "Excuse me, ma'am, The couple would like only immediate party members in this area for now. Immediate party members. I wanted to laugh, though it would have come out cracked and bitter. I was not immediate anymore. I was peripheral. I was not the root. I was a branch cut off, placed to the side where no one would notice its absence. The evening lengthened, the speeches continued, and every detail reminded me of how thoroughly I had been managed. The favors at the tables bore the initials of the bride and groom entwined in gold lettering, but there was no trace of the family that had come before. No mention in the slideshow of the childhood photographs that should have included me. No reminder of the woman who had stood behind every achievement. My daughter had edited me out of her history as thoroughly as she had edited me out of her photographs. The subtle cruelty of it was that no one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they accepted it as natural, as if a woman my age should fade into the wallpaper, should be grateful simply to be present in the room at all. At one point, the music softened, and the DJ announced a special dance. Bride and father. The crowd applauded warmly, and my daughter stepped into the center with her father, my ex-husband, who had contributed almost nothing to her upbringing, who had missed birthdays and skipped school recitals, who had not been there when she broke her arm or when she cried herself to sleep after her first heartbreak. And yet there he was, leading her proudly across the floor, both of them smiling for the cameras, both of them perfectly framed in the lights. I clapped politely, as expected, but inside I was hollowed out. If he could be celebrated, if his presence could be placed at the center while mine was pushed to the shadows, then I knew with certainty this was not about fairness or memory. It was about appearances, about what looked right for the pictures. My wrinkles did not look right. My tired eyes did not look right. My truth did not look right. That was the escalation. Not a single cruel act, but the slow, suffocating erasure of me from every part of the evening. By the time the bouquet was tossed, by the time the last of the photographs were staged, I was no longer waiting for inclusion. I was simply enduring, pressing my lips together to keep from trembling, reminding myself that I was still alive, that invisibility does not mean death, that the story was not finished. Yet the weight of it pressed hard, and I wondered if this was how it would be from now on. Always on the margins, always cropped out, always a ghost in the background of someone else's narrative. I sat back down at the far table, hands folded, spine rigid, and told myself I would not cry, not here, not in front of people who would misinterpret my tears as bitterness instead of pain. I smiled when others looked my way. I nodded at jokes I did not hear. I sipped water as if it were wine, and I pretended I was exactly where I wanted to be. That was the first escalation. The transformation of neglect into a performance of invisibility. The orchestration of my absence so complete that even I began to wonder if perhaps I truly did not belong. The shift began almost against my will, as if some hidden current beneath the surface of the evening had finally pulled me forward, refusing to let me sit motionless in that dark corner any longer. I had spent hours shrinking myself, folding my hands tightly in my lap, pressing my lips into a thin smile that convinced no one, rehearsing the art of vanishing in plain sight. And yet the very weight of my silence began to suffocate me until I realized that to keep it would be more dangerous than to break it. I had promised myself I would not draw attention, that I would not embarrass my daughter or disturb her vision of perfection. But the truth is that humiliation burns hotter when it is swallowed, and eventually Something inside you insists on release. The moment came after the father-daughter dance, when the lights dimmed slightly, and the master of ceremonies invited anyone who wished to speak to offer a toast to the couple. One by one, friends of the groom stood, glasses raised, telling carefully polished stories that made people laugh in practiced rhythms. A bridesmaid spoke about late nights in college, another about the moment the bride had confided she had met the man she would marry. I listened, my chest heavy, my throat tight, my body buzzing with the knowledge that if I did not speak now, I would leave this place erased forever. I do not know what force lifted me from my chair, but suddenly I was on my feet, my knees unsteady, my pulse hammering in my temples. For a moment the room blurred. I felt every gaze flicker toward me, some startled, some curious, some already shifting uncomfortably in their seats, because they knew I was not on the schedule. I was not part of the plan. My daughter's eyes widened. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, perhaps to stop me, but she remained seated, frozen, and in that pause I took my chance. I walked to the stage, each step heavier than the last, and when I reached the microphone, my hands trembled so violently I had to clutch the stem to keep from dropping it. The DJ hesitated, the room hushed, and in the silence, I felt my heart break open in a way that made words possible. I did not begin with a joke or with a neat anecdote prepared in advance, because I had none. What came out of me was raw, unpracticed, almost too fragile to hold in the air. I spoke of the first time I saw my daughter, minutes after she was born, when her tiny fists curled against my chest and her eyes opened wide as if she were already searching for something she did not yet know she had found. I spoke of nights when fevers kept us both awake, when I rocked her in my arms and whispered songs I made up on the spot, songs no one else had ever heard and no one ever would. I spoke of how she had wanted piano lessons and how I had worked weekends, skipped meals, and sold a piece of jewelry to afford them, because nothing mattered more to me than giving her every chance at joy. I spoke of her heartbreaks, her triumphs, the moments she wanted to give up, and the moments she soared higher than I ever thought she could. My voice shook, cracked, steadied again, and I could feel the room shifting around me. For the first time all evening, the guests were silent, not with the politeness of waiting their turn, but with the weight of listening, really listening. Their eyes were not on the chandeliers, not on their glasses, not on the photographer. They were on me, and in their gaze I felt something I had been denied all day: acknowledgement. Even the photographer raised his camera, slowly, almost reverently, and aimed it at me, capturing the tremor in my hands, the tears trembling on the edge of my lashes, the unguarded truth of a mother who had been told to stay invisible and who refused to obey. I cannot tell you if my daughter heard me, not fully. She sat rigid, her face unreadable, her smile forced, her eyes darting toward the guests as if gauging their reaction more than mine. But I know that others heard, because when I finished, when my voice finally broke and I whispered, "I only ever wanted you to know how deeply you were loved," there was no polite applause, no scattered clinking of glasses. There was a swell, a rising sound of people clapping, some standing, some even wiping their eyes. And in that moment, I realized I had reclaimed something they had tried to strip from me. They had wanted me silent. They had wanted me hidden. They had wanted me erased. But the truth had a way of writing itself back into the story, and I had just spoken it aloud. As I stepped down from the stage, my body trembling with the effort. People reached for me. A distant cousin squeezed my hand. A friend of the groom nodded solemnly. Even a few strangers touched my shoulder gently, as if to say, "We saw you, we heard you, you exist." And for the first time that day, I felt not erased, but present. My daughter's anger would come later. I knew it already. But in that moment it did not matter, because the silence had been broken, and I had found my voice again after hours of swallowing it down. That was the shift, the midpoint, the moment when the story turned, not because I had been invited to the center, but because I had claimed it for myself, trembling but unyielding, fragile but undeniable. The confrontation did not erupt immediately after my words. Instead, it ripened slowly, carried on the undercurrent of the night like a storm moving closer over calm water, until its weight pressed down on everything around us. I knew, even as the applause still echoed and as people leaned toward me with eyes shining from tears they had not expected to shed, that my daughter would not forgive the breach. For her, the day was supposed to be an immaculate portrait, a flawless series of curated moments, and I had introduced something unruly, something human, something she had tried so desperately to keep out of sight. I returned to my table with my body trembling, not from shame, but from the strange exhilaration of having spoken after hours of being silenced, yet across the room her gaze locked on mine. Hard, unyielding. Her mouth pulled into a smile that fooled the guests, but not me. I knew that smile. It was the mask she wore when she was furious and yet determined to appear composed. The same mask she had used as a teenager when she wanted to hide from the world, but not from herself. The evening went on, but I was no longer in exile. Strangers and relatives came to me, touched my hand, pressed my arm, whispered that my words had been the most beautiful of the night. Some said that it reminded them of their own mothers. Some confessed they had never considered how much sacrifice lay behind a daughter's shining wedding day, and one elderly guest told me softly that my speech had made her think of her late mother, and that she felt, for the first time in years, that her mother was near again. These were not empty compliments. I felt the weight of sincerity in them, and with each one my back straightened a little more, my presence solidified, my voice echoed again in the silence I had thought would devour me. But the more they reached for me, the more my daughter recoiled, as though my existence was stealing something she believed belonged solely to her. When the music swelled again and people moved to the dance floor, I lingered by the edge, content to watch, to savor the sense of being seen at last. But that was when she approached me. Her hand clutched my wrist with a grip stronger than I remembered, her nails pressing into my skin, and her words hissed low, meant only for me. "Why did you do that? I asked you not to make a scene. I asked you to stay out of the pictures, to stay in the background, and you had to climb onto the stage and make it about you." Her breath was hot with anger, and her eyes darted around to see if anyone was watching us. I kept my voice calm, though my heart was pounding, and I told her I had not made it about me, that I had only spoken of love, that I had spoken as a mother, not as a rival. She shook her head, her lips trembling slightly, and she said, "You don't understand. You never understand. I wanted this day to be perfect, and you ruined it. Everyone will remember your tears instead of my smile." Her words hit harder than any blow. To her, my love was not a gift. It was a blemish, something to be hidden away. To her, my presence was a threat, not a foundation. And yet, as she spoke, I noticed something else. A flicker in her eyes that was not just anger, but fear. A fear that perhaps the truth I had voiced would resonate more deeply than the polished surface she had tried to offer. In that moment, I understood that what she resented was not merely my intrusion, but the fact that people had responded to it, that the applause had risen, that the photographs now contained an image of me that was real and undeniable. She wanted control, and control had slipped from her fingers. The confrontation did not end there. Later, when the dancing had slowed and the cake had been cut, I saw her speaking to the photographer, gesturing with sharp movements of her hands, pointing toward the stage where I had stood. I could not hear her words, but I could see her mouth forming the shapes of anger, and I knew she was instructing him to edit, to crop, to minimize, to ensure that the official record of the night would not carry my defiance. I wanted to laugh at the futility of it, because truth has a way of leaking even through the cracks of carefully arranged lies. But I did not. I watched in silence, my heart heavy, my body weary, knowing that no matter how she tried to erase me, at least some people had already seen, had already remembered, and that memory could not be undone. As the evening wound toward its close, the second escalation came in the form of whispers. Guests who had heard my daughter's sharp words to me now murmured their own judgments. Some sided with her, muttering that weddings were stressful, that brides should be allowed their way, that I had been selfish to step forward when I had not been asked. Others defended me, saying a mother's voice is never out of place at her daughter's wedding, that love is not a performance, but a truth that demands to be spoken. The divide rippled through the room, subtle but undeniable, and I found myself at the center of a storm I had not intended to summon. My daughter glared at me from across the room, her face stiff, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, while her new husband placed an uncertain arm around her shoulders, his expression caught between sympathy and confusion. It should have broken me, but instead something unexpected rose within. For years I had been quiet, compliant, accepting whatever scraps of recognition were given, always grateful to be tolerated, always fearful of overstepping. But now, standing in the aftermath of my words, I realized that the storm itself was proof of my existence. You cannot cause division if you are invisible. You cannot provoke whispers if you are nothing. The very fact that people argued over my place meant that I had a place, even if they did not want to grant it. That realization steadied me, like a stone in my pocket, solid and undeniable. The night ended with my daughter brushing past me without a word, her veil trailing like smoke behind her, her shoulders rigid with fury. She did not hug me, did not thank me, did not even glance at me as she left with her husband. I stood there, watching her walk away, feeling the sting of rejection pierce deeper than ever. Yet beneath it, a strange clarity pulsed. I had lost her smile. Perhaps I had even lost her entirely. But I had not lost myself. For the first time in years, I had spoken in my own voice, not in the soft, diminished tone of someone begging for permission, but in the full, trembling truth of a woman who had lived and given and refused to vanish. That was the second escalation. Not just her fury, not just the whispers, not just the attempt to erase me from the record, but the dawning understanding that this battle was not about photographs or parties at all. It was about the fundamental question of whether I still existed in her story, whether I had the right to be seen, whether motherhood expired when beauty faded, whether decades of sacrifice could be dismissed with a polite request to step aside. The pressure tested me, bent me, threatened to crush me, but it also sharpened me. It showed me that silence is not peace, invisibility is not kindness, and erasure is not love. When I left the hall that night, walking alone beneath the heavy sky, I did not cry as I thought I would. Instead, I breathed in the damp air, let it fill my lungs, and whispered to myself that I had survived something important, something irreversible. They had tried to keep me off the stage, out of the photographs, away from the center. But for one moment I had stood where they told me not to, and for one moment the world had seen me. That could not be undone, no matter how many albums excluded me, no matter how many smiles were forced over clenched teeth. And as I walked into the night, I realized that this was only the beginning. The climax came not in the noise of that night, but in the quiet aftermath, when the photographs began to appear, and the official record of the wedding took shape in glossy prints and digital albums. My daughter had believed she could control everything, that by instructing the photographer to crop and edit, she could erase the moment of my defiance, could sculpt her memory into something pristine and untouched by the weight of my presence. Yet truth has its own stubborn way of surfacing, and no matter how carefully the images were arranged, one photograph slipped through, and it was not hers. It was not his. It was mine. A guest had captured it, not with professional lighting or careful angles, but with an honest eye. Me standing on the stage, clutching the microphone, my face trembling with both fear and strength, my eyes shining with tears that were not weakness, but something fiercer. It was not glamorous. It was not curated, but it was real. And when that image spread quietly among the guests, forwarded from phone to phone, shared in whispers, it became the moment that people remembered more than any posed smile or choreographed dance. I learned of it first when a cousin called me days later, her voice soft but insistent. She told me she had saved the picture because it was the most moving moment of the night, the only one that felt alive. She said that while the wedding album looked like something from a magazine, sterile and perfect, that one picture held the truth, the weight of love and sacrifice that no makeup or editing could disguise. Others reached out too. An aunt, a friend of the groom, even a neighbor who had attended only out of obligation. Each of them told me, in their own way, that what I had said, what I had revealed, had mattered more than anything else that day. They did not remember the color of the flowers or the taste of the cake. They remembered my voice breaking as I spoke of rocking my daughter through fevers, of sacrificing for her joy, of loving her without condition. Meanwhile, my daughter seethed. She called me once, her voice tight and cold, and accused me of stealing her moment, of humiliating her, of making the wedding about myself. I listened in silence, because there was nothing I could say that she would hear. When she paused for breath, I told her simply that I had not spoken for applause. I had spoken because my love was real, and it deserved to be heard. She hung up on me. For days afterward, I thought the guilt would consume me, that perhaps I had truly done wrong. But then I would open my phone, see that unfiltered photograph again, and remember the warmth of the applause, the tears in strangers' eyes, the way the room had shifted from performance to truth. That picture was proof that I was not delusional, that my existence could not be denied. The most decisive act came not from argument, but from my own hand. I printed that photograph large and clear, and I framed it, not for her, not for anyone else, but for myself. I placed it on the small table in my apartment where the morning sun fell strongest, and every time I looked at it, I remembered the feeling of standing on that stage. It was not about glory. It was about reclaiming a piece of myself that had been chipped away for years by dismissal, by silence, by being told to wait, to stay out of sight, to remain small. That framed photograph became my rebellion, my testament, my refusal to vanish. It was irreversible, because no matter what she did, no matter how carefully she cropped her official album, there was at least one image she could not control, and it belonged to me. The climax was not loud, not violent, but it was final. It was the moment I understood that my dignity did not depend on her permission, that my story could not be erased by her shame. It was the moment I stopped asking to be included and instead chose to claim my own presence. The wedding had been her day, but the truth had been mine, and the truth had spoken loudly enough that others carried it with them. And so, the balance shifted at last. I was no longer begging to be seen. I was already seen. The resolution came not with reconciliation, but with a quieter kind of peace, the kind that does not require an audience or an apology, but settles into your bones like a steady warmth after a long winter. In the weeks that followed the wedding, I waited for my daughter to reach out, for her to soften, for her to perhaps remember that a mother's presence is not something you can edit from your life without consequence. The call never came. There were no invitations, no thank yous, no acknowledgement that I had been there at all. Her official album appeared on social media, immaculate and polished, and as I scrolled through the endless images of gowns and flowers and smiling faces, I did not find myself once. It was as though I had never existed, as though the decades of motherhood had been replaced by a single instruction: stay out of the photos. For a moment, it stung, sharp as glass under the skin, but then I set the phone down and looked across my small apartment at the framed photograph on my table, the one that no one could take from me, and I realized that absence from her story did not mean absence from my own. I began to notice that life after the wedding felt lighter, as if I had shed something I had carried for too long. I no longer measured my worth in how often I was invited or how close to the center I was seated. I woke early, made tea, opened my curtains to let the sun spill across the room, and reminded myself each morning that visibility does not come from being included in someone else's album, but from refusing to erase yourself from your own. When neighbors asked how I was, I did not speak of the wedding. I spoke of the book I was reading, the walk I had taken, the small joys I had chosen for myself. Slowly, I began to feel the truth of what I had discovered on that stage: that a life cannot be lived waiting for someone else to grant you permission to exist. And yet, though I carried disappointment, I carried no hatred. I thought of my daughter often, and I wished her well. I hoped she would find happiness in her new marriage, that she would build the life she wanted, even if she chose to build it without me at its center. What I no longer wished was to force my way back into her curated picture. Let her have her perfect frames. Let her have her flawless smiles. I had mine too, and they were not flawless, but they were honest. That was enough. The final act of closure came one evening when I wrote a letter, not to send, but to keep, folded in the drawer of my nightstand. In it, I told her that I loved her, that I always had, that nothing she did could erase the truth of those years we shared, the nights of sickness, the mornings of laughter, the sacrifices no one else would ever see. But I also wrote that I would no longer stand in the corner waiting to be noticed, that I would no longer diminish myself to preserve her illusion. I wrote that my life was still mine, and that I intended to live it fully, whether or not she chose to look my way. When I finished, I folded the letter neatly, slipped it into the drawer, and felt as though a door had quietly closed behind me. Now, when I think of the wedding, I do not remember the exclusion, though it was sharp at the time. I remember the moment I stood on that stage, the way the room hushed, the way truth filled the air until it could not be ignored. That was my gift to myself, and it cannot be undone. So if another woman, another mother, another grandmother ever hears the words I heard, stay out of the photos, stay in the background, stay invisible, I want her to remember me. I want her to know that she does not need an invitation to stand in her own light. There is a place on the stage for her too, a moment where her trembling voice can cut through the silence, and when she takes it, she will discover, as I did, that sometimes being seen, even once, even briefly, is enough to change everything. That is my ending, not dramatic, not triumphant, but steady and true. I was asked to be invisible, but I was not. I was told to step aside, but I stepped forward. And now I live not as an erased figure, but as a whole woman, carrying my own story, framed in my own truth.